more VAI certified Sensei practical symposium on DVT and thrombophilia. And today we are absolutely lucky because we have with us a very, very prominent speaker, esteemed speaker who needs really no introduction. Dr. Ramkrishna Pinjala, previously Professor of Surgery and Head of Department of Vascular Surgery at the Nizam's Institute of Hyderabad, and now, of course, with the Apollo hospitals and other hospitals as a private consultant in Hyderabad. Of course, you all know he has published multiple papers and written many articles. As I said, again, he needs no introduction. So in this particular topic, I think he's the right person to address us today. After that, after his talk, we'll have a case presentation by Dr. Sri Kumar, which will also enlighten us on the little practical aspects of this particular medical problem. We're also lucky today to have two very senior people with us as our chairpersons. One is, of course, Dr. Deki Wadia, the past president of VAI and the Raja of Rajkot, as they call him. And of course, a lot of work in deep vein thrombosis. And he will contribute his comments and steer the discussion later. We also have with us today the president of the Mexican College of Phlebology and the incoming president of the Latin American Society of Phlebology and Lymphology, Dr. Javier. Is Dr. Javier with us today? Has he joined? Because I can't see his photograph on, but I'm sure he'll also contribute.
He's there.
He's there. Lovely. Yeah. So Dr. Javier, welcome to our program and thank you very much for joining us. I know at a very inconvenient time in Mexico. Thanks so much for joining us. And finally, but of course not the least, we have two, again, very eminent people, members of the VAI, Dr. Professor Ajay Khanna from the Banaras Hindu University. Again, extremely learned gentleman who has written so many books and been editors of so many books and chapters and so many research articles. And he will also, of course, help to drive the discussion. And of course, finally, Dr. Sunil Rajendra, a very active member of our Venous Association of India, who will help us in this program. I would also like to thank, of course, Servier, which we know has been guiding and backing the Venous Association of India since its inception. Important thing to know about Servier, it has brands which are produced in India. In the current scenario, there is no Chinese API. It's very, very important in today's scenario. And their API, which is the active pharmaceutical ingredient, is sourced from France. And they have been doing a lot of sterling service during the COVID times. As you know, they've been having very active on the Facebook page, and all of us have been on Facebook and done so many programs with them. And they have been helping us to achieve the vision of Venous Association of India with not only other doctors all over the country, but also the lay public. And they also have something called the town hall where speakers are live. And they basically, you know, Dr. Mahajan, Dr. Selvaraj, Dr. Pranay Pawar, Dr. Sau, they've all done these lovely programs in the past. And next week, we're going to be having, on the 7th of September, Dr. Deki Wadia himself, again, talking to us on how chronic venous disease involves. So once again, thank you, Servier, and for all your support to us. And let's get ahead with the program. May I now ask Dr. Pinjala to kindly go ahead with his talk.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, today I will try to place before you few facts about thrombophilia in our clinical practice. Deep vein thrombosis and its relation to the different types of thrombophilia. Basically, there are two factors: inherited thrombophilias and acquired hypercoagulable states. The inherited thrombophilias are of different types, such as antithrombin deficiency, protein S deficiency, protein C deficiency, dysfunction of coagulation factors such as dysfibrinogenemia, factor V laden, prothrombin gene mutation. These are the hereditary factors. When you look at the acquired hypercoagulable states, they are malignancy, cancer, surgery of different types, which is more than 3 hours in duration, immobilization for more than 3 days, bedriddenness or due to some morbid state, and internally introduced catheters, indwelling central venous catheters, trauma, extensive trauma, fractured pelvis and fractured femur, pregnancy, which is again a very important risk factor, medications, patients who are taking oral contraceptive pills, hormone replacement therapy, tamoxifen, antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, APLS syndrome. Then comes myeloproliferative disorders, which are known as polycythemia vera and so on and so forth, paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, inflammatory bowel disease, and nephrotic syndrome. So the global burden of thrombosis, epidemiological aspects. I think thromboembolic conditions were estimated to account for 1 in 4 deaths worldwide in 2010 and are leading cause of mortality. Global public awareness is substantially lower for pulmonary embolism and deep vein thrombosis than heart attack and stroke. Many people don't know that there is a condition called pulmonary embolism and deep vein thrombosis, but they know all about heart attack and stroke. That means there is a lot of gap between the knowledge and the understanding of the disease by the public. Over time, the incidence and mortality rates of these conditions have improved in the developed countries, but they are increasing in the developing countries. Public health efforts to measure the disease burden and increase awareness of the symptoms and risk factors need to improve, particularly in the low and middle income regions, to address this leading cause of morbidity and mortality. Just a second. So to make it much more vivid, there are many listed by me here: secondary thrombophilia and inherited thrombophilia. In inherited thrombophilia, the first 5 are commonly known to people like us, but there are also ABO blood group, non-O group are more prone for thrombotic disorders, fibrinogen gamma, factor 11 abnormality, homocystinuria, increased plasma factors such as fibrinogen, prothrombin 8, 9, and 11, dysfibrinogenemia, sickle cell disease, and also weakly supported data, hypofibrinolysis, hypoplasminogenemia, dysplasminogenemia, reduced tissue plasmin activator, increased plasminogenesis, so on and so forth. There are so many factors involved, like factor 13 polymorphisms, increased thrombin activatable fibrinolysis inhibitor, TAFI. TAFI is also well known to produce thrombosis. So to make it simple, prevalence of thrombophilic alterations in the general population, not that much as one would expect to see. If you see antithrombin 3, the prevalence is 0.05 to 0.2%. And it was found and observed from 1965 onwards, this antithrombin came into existence. Protein C, 1981, the year 1981, it was identified. And the incidence is not much, 0.2 to 0.3%. Protein S, we still don't know exactly what is the incidence of prevalence of protein S. So mutation that is factor 5 laden, 3 to 5% in the European population, 3 to 7% in the European population was found to have factor 5 laden. But in India, it is not that much. It's not that much. It is much less. There are few studies where they have tested the factor 5 laden in India also, but the results are not so much as you have seen in the European population. So similarly, factor 2 gene abnormality G20210A, from this to this amino acid shift will produce mutated factor gene. It was identified in 1996. The incidence is 1 to 3%. In my practice, I have seen only 2 patients with factor 2 gene abnormality. Both had pulmonary embolism, recurrent pulmonary embolism, in spite of medical management with them. So lupus anticoagulant, 3 to 5%. This is very commonly seen in our rheumatology patients. Lupus anticoagulant. Increased factor 8 levels are seen more frequently in Indian population also. 10% of them have shown increased factor 8 levels. So the major risk factors of VT include hospitalization, recent surgery, cancer, and immobilization. In addition, there are specific genetic conditions that predispose primarily to VT, such as factor 5 laden gene mutation, prothrombin gene mutation, deficiencies of antithrombin 3 protein C, protein S, and the antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. So whenever we identify the thrombophilic features, whether acquired or congenital, there are three levels of thrombosis that can happen. There can be venous thrombosis, there can be arterial thrombosis, or there can be microvascular thrombosis. So we identify them as the number of how many folds of increase in the thrombophilia. If you have factor 5 laden, you have 8 to 80 fold increase in the risk of thrombosis. If you have factor 2 gene abnormality, there is 5 to 15 fold increase in the risk of thrombosis. If you have serpin T, this is a serine protease inhibitor, more than 1.5 to 2% fold increase in the risk. So similarly, factor 5 laden, factor 2, all these things, mutation prevalence, the incidence of mutation in the general population has been mentioned here. So similarly, inherited thrombophilia and the lifetime venous thrombosis burden is reduced. If you ask me, if there is a patient of factor 5 laden, 90% of the patients don't develop thrombosis in their lifetime. Only 10% of those people who have existing factor 5 laden do develop thrombotic complications. That has to be kept in our mind, that a positive gene factor need not always be associated with thrombosis. There the crux comes, and that is why we say you should know which patient to screen, which patient not to screen. So if thrombophilia relative risk is 4 times of VTE, if there is factor 2 gene abnormality, if there is protein C, protein S deficiency, relative risk of VTE is 6 times. Factor 5 laden mutant heterozygous 10 times. Antithrombin 3 deficiency 20-fold, relative risk is 20%. Factor 5 laden, like that. There are a number of papers. I may look repeating the matter, but if you see the literature, all these things are repeatedly mentioned in the literature. Thrombophilia in East Asian countries, are there genetic differences in these countries? Yes, there seems to be quite difference in the countrywide statistics. In some countries, they seem to be a little higher. European population, the Caucasian population, there seems to be a little higher. But in Asian population, this genetic mutation seems to be less common, or maybe the testing is less, or maybe the testing is less. That may be one reason. But there is differences between the European population and Asian population. So magnitude of potentially inappropriate thrombophilia testing in the inpatient hospital setting. So this is the major concern, because everybody is asking for these tests now. The criteria for defining test appropriateness are formulated by utilizing a combination of major society guidelines and literature review. The criteria placed emphasis upon the order of test, clinical relevance, and reliability, and were subsequently reviewed by the senior hematologists with specific expertise on thrombosis. So to tell that this particular test has been asked unwantedly is the question. If you see the data that has been collected, blue line indicates number of appropriately recommended testing. Yellow line indicates number of inappropriately recommended testing. So in our society, in our practice, you will see the proportion of inappropriate testing was much more for factor 5 laden, prothrombin, protein C, protein S, antithrombin activity, lupus anticoagulant. But for the anticardiolipin IgG, IgM, this is more appropriately recommended. Beta 2 glycoprotein GP1 is also more appropriately recommended. DRVVT, dilute Russell Viper venom test, is also more appropriately recommended. JAK2, I think people have recommended only when it is required. But these factors, these gene testing has been done inappropriately in most of the hospitals that they have done this in this trial. So yes, same thing also is happening in India, and one should be concerned about this. So these factors, either genetic or acquired, on their own, they may not sometimes produce symptoms. They may not produce pathology. But when they are combined, for example, this is a case, there is heterozygous FP factor 5 laden and protein C deficiency. On the day 5 of warfarin treatment, the apparent concomitant bilateral adrenal hemorrhage infarction has occurred. So this indicates that when you are trying to treat one, protein C is differentially reduced, produce cutaneous necrosis, and also bleed in this patient. So one should be cautious while treating these congenital thrombophilias, because they may have multiple genetic factors responsible for thrombosis. Just because you found one, do not stop there. So we should know testing and timing. In thrombophilia, the crux is testing and timing. When to test is very important than just simply testing. Timing of the diagnostic thrombophilia testing, when should I test? Many of the natural anticoagulant and procoagulant plasma factors are acute phase reactants. Acute thrombosis can transiently reduce the levels of antithrombin and occasionally protein C, protein S. Consequently, testing is usually not recommended during acute phase of thrombosis. During the acute phase, we should not ask for thrombophilia profile. So regarding this, we have written a paper and published it in Indian Journal of Surgery long back in 2012. And that was the time we realized that testing the patients should not be a routine procedure. We should select the patients, and only in selected group of patients we should test them for the thrombophilia factors. So now we are also noticing coagulation associated coagulopathy, COVID associated coagulopathy, COVID-19 associated coagulopathy. And many patients are succumbing to this mortality, partly due to the associated coagulopathy. And October 13th is the World Thrombosis Day. Eyes should be open to thrombosis is the catchword slogan of this year, World Thrombosis Day on October 13th. So the site of thrombosis and coagulation defect. See, most of these precipitate venous thrombosis, very few of them produce arterial thrombosis, like hyperhomocystinemia, antiphospholipid antibodies are associated with arterial thrombosis, but remaining are more often associated with venous thrombosis. So the timing of the sample collection and interpretation of the test is of utmost importance. False low values of protein C, protein S, AT. Many times I get consultations that, sir, we have done the protein C, protein S, AT, and they are abnormally low. And when I look at it, they might have already given a heparin or anticoagulant, and then they do the testing. You should not do the testing when the patients have already received anticoagulant, because that will affect the tests and the values. So factor V laden and APC resistance, activated protein C resistance. Incidence of factor V laden is reported to be low in Indian population, ranging from 3 to 4.1%. On the other hand, surprisingly, APC resistance has been reported to be 12.5 to 39.2 in Indian patients. This is the discrepancy. So what we should do is, we should first do APC resistance, APCR, and if it is positive, then only we should ask for factor V laden. APCR can be positive in more number of patients due to other conditions which are mimicking this resistance. So APC resistance is not equal to factor V laden. Only few of them, or 50% of them, may actually have factor V laden. In this study that was published by Bhattacharya, APCR was detected in 19% of the patients, and it was seen in 4% of the controls. The method used is supposed to have over 99% sensitivity specificity for factor V laden. So the acquired thrombophilia mainly consists of lupus anticoagulants and anticardiolipin antibodies, that is APLS. So there are many different types of lupus anticoagulants, and most of the times we do the APTT testing, and if it is prolonged, then you ask for DRVT, VVT, dilute Russell Viper Venum test, and based upon that we decide whether the patient has got significant antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. So there is so much of information available about the Indian data also. There are many Indian studies published, and when to consider testing is another concern. VT occurring at a younger age, you should keep in mind below 50 years to test for thrombophilia. If it is unprovoked DVT, which is recurrent VTA, you should also keep in mind you may require the patient to send for thrombophilia testing. Thrombosis at unusual sites such as splanchnic, cerebral sinuses, renal veins. My factor II gene abnormality patients had cerebral sinus venous thrombosis. I think there seems to be a predilection for cerebral sinus venous thrombosis with factor II gene abnormality. So unusually extensive spontaneous VT, massive thrombosis of the mesenteric venous system, you should suspect thrombophilia. There is a family history of VTE, asymptomatic individuals. So all these things should be kept in mind. If there is more than 3 unexplained pregnancy loss before week 10, or more than one loss after week 10, one should consider checking for thrombophilia. May results of thrombophilia screening of a patient with DVT be useful for relatives? Yes, for asymptomatic carriers to reduce the exposition to the other risk factors, to offer appropriate prophylaxis in high risk situations. So this is again a chart to show if the male family member is positive for thrombophilia, what is the risk and what is the reasonable testing. So you don't have to test for factor V Leiden in the sons or brothers, or you don't have homozygous FEL prothrombin testing if it is a male member. But if it is a female member, double heterozygous abnormality, you should check it. You should follow this format. So again, so many things have been placed before us. So NEJM also gives similarly, do not test at a time of VTE event, do not test while patient is receiving anticoagulant therapy, do not test if VTE is provoked with strong risk factors, consider testing if you have considered testing, young age associated with provoking factors, strong family history, then you should consider testing. So this is a paper published by Indian authors in Sao Paulo Medicine. Conclusions: prevalences of APR resistance, protein C, protein SR controls were 4%, 0%, 2%. The incidences seems to be variable from country to country. India has got lower incidence of these risk factors. So the clinical features of patients with thrombophilia include all these things. We can discuss in this thing. So is the routine thrombophilia testing helpful in stroke patients? It is unjustified. There is no need to do the thrombophilia testing routinely in stroke patients. Discretionary thrombophilia test acquisition and outcomes in patients with venous thromboembolism in real world clinical setting is more practical. So thrombophilia in women needs special attention because the risk of thrombosis is high in women during pregnancy, during oral contraceptive pill intake or oral hormone therapy. So the history of pregnancy and complications one should keep in mind if they are asymptomatic, if they are symptomatic, if they had previous pregnancy complications, if there is higher risk of preeclampsia, then also you should start thinking about testing for thrombophilias. Thrombophilia in unexplained pregnancy loss in Indian patients was also found to be high, and it was both early and late pregnancy losses were common in those patients who have thrombophilia. Women with unexplained pregnancy loss should be screened for presence of thrombophilias even in Indian patients. This paper was published in National Medical Journal and it was published in 2008 itself. So they have tested all these things in Indian population also, and they found out they were abnormal. Not only women, the infants and children also need special attention because homozygous abnormalities of the genes can be fulminant and they can result in fulminant purpura. So antithrombin 3 deficiency, now there is a medicine available for antithrombin 3 artificially synthesized by a genetically modified animal. This protein can be synthesized and given to the patients according to a formula. Antithrombin 3 supplementation can save those patients who had homozygous antithrombin 3 deficiency. Otherwise, their mortality is very high. So to conclude, my dear friends, thrombophilias can be of two types, congenitally inherited and acquired. The congenitally inherited will be less than 10% in total. Those patients who have got positive genetic abnormalities need not develop thrombosis in their lifetime. 90% of them may not develop, only 10% of them they develop. So that means they increase the risk of thrombosis with the other associated factors. When they join together hands, they produce thrombosis. So one should be cautious in seeing these patients and doing unnecessary testing and unnecessary anticoagulation if they are not associated with other risk factors. One has to be cautious because sometimes there can result in bleeding complications or skin thrombosis like I have shown you in these patients. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Pinjala. As usual, a very erudite lecture with a lot of practical aspects which were covered, which are useful to us in clinical practice. I'm sure all of us enjoyed your lovely lecture. And
Thank you.
we'll keep the questions and answers and your comments towards the end so that we can have a much longer discussion.
Okay, thank you.
My pleasure. Now we will invite Dr. R.C. Srikumar, who is going to do a case presentation for us. Dr. Srikumar, the platform is yours. Dr. Srikumar, can you unmute, please? Can you unmute Dr. Srikumar? Dr. Srikumar?
Yes, yes.
Go ahead, please. Go ahead.
He's sharing the screen.
Sorry for the.
No problem, no problem.
Good evening to all. Very happy to have it's a small case. In fact, my residents prepared a case from the ward itself for a simple case for some discussion on a practical problem which we do face routinely. So it's a case of deep vein thrombosis. The patient is a 43-year-old male working in a shop, standing for a long time. And he presented non-healing ulcers in the medial aspect of right lung for 4 months.
Okay.
He was undergone Trendelenburg surgery with a stripping 2 years back for a varicose vein in a local hospital. And he developed some sort of edema 4 days after the surgery, as he said. And he was advised to take bed rest for 7 days after the surgery, even with edema, without much evaluation. The surgery was Trendelenburg and stripping done 2 years back. Pre-op, there was no coagulation profile done. And the Doppler was done, shows SFJ incompetence, the 2 perforators, and no evidence of any DVT as per the available records. And post-op period, he has not put on any anticoagulants, no heparin, and put on compression bandage and a bed rest. That's a routine surgery. But he developed some amount of edema in the right lower limb 4 days after the procedure, with an ulcer in the medial aspect of ankle 2 months after, which is again treated conservatively with antibiotics, anti-inflammatory agents, and some bed rest and keeping the limb elevated. And a Doppler was done at that time, which was thrombus in the femoral popliteal segment, which was referred to somebody and treated conservatively. And families, there's nothing contributed to the patient. Personal history is a heavy smoker. Still, he's smoking more than 10 cigarettes per day for many years. He's occasionally alcoholic. No history of any pan-chewing. His bowel water habit is normal. He's a predominantly non-vegetarian. Examination, nothing much contributed in the general examination. The right lower lip, there's extensive hyperpigmentation in fact, multiple heel ulcers there, recurrent ulcerations and healings. And there is edema in the lower limb. Distal pulses are normal. Arterial structure is absolutely normal. Opposite limb also normal. Abdomen is normal, no distension or no mass present. Nothing suggestive of any compression of the iliac veins. Cardiovascular system is so there's no evidence of any failure, and the sounds are normal, no other sounds. Other systems are normal. We're in a Doppler study of the venous system. SFJ not seen postoperative. LS is not seen. There's still 2 perforators. Not much significant. There's an organized thrombus in the below segment, the FEMPOP segment with a partial recanalization, and ultrasound shows again normal. We're in a coagulation profile. Blood routine, everything is normal. ESR, CRP is not elevated. Homocysteine is elevated by 32. APL is less than 10. Protein C and protein are normal. Peripheral smear is normal. Now the patient is on VARF 6 mg once a day. Folic acid diet regulations are advised. PTINR is 1.8 last value. He's maintaining between 1.5 to 2. He was put on 4-layer bandage in between. Once stops, ulcer heals. Now he's not on any bandage because there's no active ulcer now. I've done a CT venogram. It shows normal iliac veins, no compression of iliac veins. Course of the patient is he's on warfarin, he's on folic acid. He's a moderate compliance, but he's quite unhappy about the development of the lesion. And there's no evidence of pulmonary embolism. Recurrent ulcerations occurs once in 3 to 4 months. He has developed one ulcer and got some treatment. He is to undergo at least 1 hospital visit per 3 months for ulcer-related issues, and it has a gross mobility. So my questions are, which routine pre-op coagulation is required for varicose vein surgery? What's the role of heparin in routine varicose vein open procedures? Of course, for a laser and RFA, you do give heparin. Do we give anticoagulants in the post-operative phase routinely? And what's the role for NOACs comparing to warfarin? And do we need any intervention in this patient? So with this, those are my just this simple case. But this is a very common issue happens, particularly people undergoing surgery for the periphery.
Dr. Srikumar, I think this is a very a case which has a lot of practical implications of regular management of the patients. Especially the last slide which you showed has so many questions which are routinely confronting on a day-to-day basis. At this point, I would like to invite our chairman, both Dr. Dekiwadia and Dr. Javier to participate. Dr. Dekiwadia, can you please comment on Dr. Srikumar's case, please?
Yeah, I would like to make a comment on Srikumar's case, and I would like to request Dr. Pinjala for one of my queries. For Srikumar's case, I think that there were varicose veins, that was operated, fair enough. There was a femoropopliteal thrombosis. Now, the patient needs a venogram. A venogram is the key factor, because unless you have a deep vein assessment done, the patient could be holding a chronic deep vein thrombosis, partially recanalized. Femoropopliteal segment thrombosis information is good enough, but it is inadequate or incomplete because it does not tell us anything about the iliac veins, as well as it does not tell us anything about the posterior tibial vein and the anteritibial vein. Many a times I have seen in deep vein thrombosis, the calf veins, the easy to follow the calf, because calf has plenty of veins. But the posterior tibial and the anteritibial veins, the named veins, they often get thrombosed. They are large, non-compressible. And in this case, I think an iliac venogram is the most important thing which should be considered, and then the treatment strategy can be found out. One thing, okay, that is my opinion for Srikumar's case presentation.
Sir, can we take Dr. Pinjala's question after Dr. Javier's comments on this case, sir?
Go ahead.
Yeah, please, please.
Yes. Dr. Javier, welcome. Dr. Javier from Mexico, welcome to our program. Thank you for joining us. And we look forward to coming to Mexico, which we missed last time. Now, Dr.
Hello,
Javier.
hello
What
to
do you
everybody.
think? What do
Thank
you
you
think
very much
about
for the
Dr.
invitation.
Welcome, welcome. You are our friend. What do you think? What are your comments on Dr. Srikumar's case?
Okay, well, first, congratulations to Dr. Pinjala. It's a very nice presentation and very complete. So about Dr. Srikumar, I want to know if this patient followed with the compression therapy.
Srikumar, are you listening to us? Dr. Srikumar, there is a question for
Dr.
you.
Srikumar.
There is a question for you. There is a question for you. Did this patient use crepe bandages?
In the post-op phase or in
post-op.
Yeah,
Yes.
post-op phase they put crepe bandage. He was on crepe bandage. During that phase he developed edema. That's
Okay. What kind of class of compression do you decide to use
class
in
2.
this
Class
patient?
2. Class 2. Maybe class,
Class
2 is done by somebody else. Then referred to us. Mostly class 2.
Okay, thank you.
We'll go back to Dr. Dekiwadia. Sir, you had some question to ask Dr. Pinjala.
I don't have a question to ask to Dr. Pinjala. I find myself much less in knowledge.
Come on.
But I want to clarify. I had a patient of DVT. That patient had vitiligo.
Okay.
We did thrombolysis. It went very well. All the veins opened up well. And on the third day, he came back again with edema. And when we did the ultrasound, all the veins had rethrombosed.
Yes.
So immediately after thrombolysis, we had started on the NOACs very well, and we had continued LMWH also. This is the time when the NOACs had just entered into it, and the NOAC was rivaroxaban. So one of the intensivists who was treating and who was involved with it, he fought with me that DVT is none of your business.
Oh,
And said DVT is anybody's business, but thrombolysis is our business and expertise, and we've been doing it. He said in a patient of vitiligo, there are this, blah, blah, he told something. That due to that, there is immediate rethrombosis. Do you have any observation on such type of or any of these thrombophilic factors which you said, are these people with vitiligo? Because since then, any DVT patient, our first observation has to expose him completely and see whether anywhere we find spots of vitiligo. So,
okay.
to know from you anything.
Okay. Vitiligo is an autoimmune disease where the melanin producing cells are destroyed by the immunology. So these patients are likely to have antibodies which are similar to APLS. So the chances of them becoming hyperthrombophilic is likely high compared to the non-immunological patients. Those patients who are immunologically challenged are likely to have resistant thrombosis. That is for quite obvious reasons. Next, coming to the Srikumar's case, I would like to say there is a chance that 10% of the DVT patients remain asymptomatic and produce varicose veins only. In those situations, post-operatively, they get exhibited. Post-operatively, they get exhibited. Pre-operatively, they were asymptomatic, well compensated DVT, chronic DVT, but presenting with only varicose veins. So somebody would do varicose vein surgery thinking that there is no DVT, but then they exhibited. Then the DVT symptoms get exhibited when he has removed the great saphenous vein, when he has applied crib bandage. So there is no flow. The DVT gets worse. And if he is having already predisposing thrombophilic factors, in addition to that, it will get worse. So patient would require anticoagulation for the rest of his life. This is what it is. Sometimes we miss DVT in asymptomatic patients who are well compensated by the chronic DVT of short segments in the deep venous system. So that has to be kept in mind. That's why patient profile is equally important. So what type of patient you are operating, what type of history patient has given you, how active the patient is, all these factors will help you in assessing the combination of risk factors.
Thank you, Dr. Pinjala.
Thank you.
I'll go back to Dr. Javier. Dr. Javier, what is the percentage of people in your country, in Mexico, who are investigated for thrombophilic factors after an episode of unprovoked DVT? And as you heard Dr. Pinjala say, that certain factors in this country are less than in the Caucasian population. What is your experience in the Mexican group of patients?
Okay, it's a very important question because I think in our studies, we can take the thrombophilia panel at least in 1% of the patients with DVT. What's the problem? Because it's very expensive to take the thrombophilia panel, and sometimes in many hospitals have the devices to study.
Correct.
But this is the reality. I think it's a very big problem because we need to study to all of the patients, but it's so difficult today for us.
Absolutely, I agree. This is the problem all over the world regarding costs. I'd now like to jump to Dr. Ajay Khanna. Sir, please unmute yourself. Please unmute Dr. Ajay Khanna. There is a question from the participants, from Dr. Sandeep exactly, and he congratulates Dr. Pinjala for his talk. And his question is that many times young thrombophilic patients ask for advice regarding marriage. What should be advice given to both these, the male and the female?
I think probably one of the things before I go on this question is that we have been always thinking that the factor 5 laden which is there is very less in the Indian population. In fact, we carried out a study published in the Annals of Vascular Surgery, though it was a very small study of only 23 patients, and we found that we carry out the activated C protein resistance in those patients. And out of the 23 patients, 10 patients had the positive APC. And as the other studies which are there from Indian scenario, which is there, they have shown that it can range from 15 to 20%, even 30%. So I think we should think in the same way that we always thought that DVT is not an Indian disease. It is only a Western disease. But we have to now see about our thrombophilia, which is there, that what we say that we do not get the patients of thrombophilia, probably that may not be true. So we have to see that, and we have to, in fact, look for our patients that whether the thrombophilia, how much is that? Now the questions Dr. Sandeep has asked about the marriage, I think probably there should be no problem as far as the marriage is concerned. You know, if somebody has got a thrombophilia, you do not treat the thrombophilia. Whatever that may be there, until it has got complicated. And complication may be in the sense of that the patient has developed blood clot either in the artery or in the vein. But the thing is that if the wife becomes pregnant, then we have to think about that what will precautions you are going to take. And as in any scenario which is there, whether it is a provoked DVT or whether it is unprovoked DVT is there, in those cases, low molecular heparin is the choice for that. And you have to keep in very close consultation with the hematologist and the gynecologist to see that how long you are going to give the patient the low molecular heparin. So that is the.
Very good, sir. I think that basically clears this particular issue. I'm now going to ask Dr. Sunil Rajendran for his comments on the talk up to now. And then I will ask Dr. Pinjala a couple of questions. Dr. Sunil, can you please unmute Dr. Sunil, please?
Sunil
Sunil.
Rajendran.
Yes,
sir.
your comments, please.
Pinjala, sir, nice talk. I just want to ask you a question. What is the role of NOACs in thrombophilic patient? Because they tend to have to take NOACs for lifelong. So, point number one is the advantage of NOACs over classical drugs like warfarin, because like APLS syndrome, they say warfarin is that NOACs are not effective as warfarin. But what is the role of NOACs in other thrombophilic conditions? Number two, what is the safety of taking NOACs for lifelong? Because patient might be on NOACs for life. So what is the safety of these NOACs in long term?
I think you have rightly pointed out that NOACs are not recommended choices for the APLS patients because sometimes they can worsen the situation. So we don't recommend NOACs in patients with APLS or antibodies, antiphospholipid antibody syndromes. So coming to the next point, what is the role of long-term NOAC therapy versus warfarin therapy? Yes, when compared to the warfarin, NOACs are much safer in terms of intracranial bleeds. The annual incidence of intracranial bleeds with warfarin can be anywhere between 1 to 8%. That means their mortality is also going to be very high. The reason being the on and off effect of warfarin is much prolonged. So if they start bleeding, to stop the bleeding, it takes a long time. But when you compare with the NOACs, which are known as rivaroxaban, apixaban, edoxaban, betrixaban, and so on and so forth, there is better safety in the intracranial bleeds. The incidence of intracranial bleeds is significantly less. But you may ask me, what are the chances of GA bleeds? Yes, there is a slight increase in the manageable GI bleeds. Clinically relevant non-major bleeds. Clinically relevant non-major bleeds will be high with the patients taking NOACs. But definitely, the bleeding risk is much less compared to the warfarin. That is where the war has ended. Number of trials that have been done, they've shown that the bleeding risk compared with warfarin is less with apixaban, rivaroxaban, edoxaban, and so on and so forth. So you can give long-term in atrial fibrillation, for example, atrial fibrillation, patients with thrombophilia and deep vein thrombosis, recurrent attacks of deep vein thrombosis. You can give them for life, except for the cost involved. So you may ask me, the next question is it affordable for a lifelong anticoagulant with the NOACs? Yes, it is expensive. It is expensive. So in those patients, you should choose Haas blood score. If the Haas blood score is more than 3, then you should go back to NOACs rather than warfarin. If the Haas blood score is less, they are less likely to develop bleeding complications. Maybe you can monitor this patient more carefully with less expensive, less economically challenging medications such as warfarin in this group of patients. I think that's what I do in my practice. I check the bleeding risk and thrombosis risk. If the bleeding risk is less, thrombotic risk is high, then I can go for the less expensive medication, warfarin or acetram. But if the patient has got high risk of bleeding and also high risk of thrombosis, then I prefer to choose NOACs for the time being.
So
I
what's
think
the
that's
role in,
very
just one question, sir. What is the role in, say, patient having protein C, protein S deficiency, role of NOACs in those thrombophilia conditions?
Yeah, there also you can give NOACs. You can give them NOACs. There is no such contraindication for the use of NOACs in those patients. But remember, heterozygous, homozygous gene abnormalities. For example, I tried to show you one picture. I'll just, if you permit me, I'll show you one slide. Can you see this medication?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Atri.
Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah, it was seen.
it was seen.
Atri is
Yeah,
antithrombin 3.
yeah. So this is the medication. Like Ajay said, there is no treatment for these deficiencies, but now we have a deficiencies treatment is available, and this is derived from a genetically modified animal. The first time in the history of the world, a genetically modified animal is producing medication for the human consumption. So the goat has been used to produce the milk, which is rich in antithrombin 3. And from the goat milk, this antithrombin 3 is derived, synthesized, extracted, and injected to the people who are having homozygous antithrombin 3 deficiency in the near infant stage or in the near childhood age, where they require medication to prevent thrombotic episodes. So this has been found to be useful and helpful in saving the lives of these patients as a direct treatment, not anticoagulant, but as a direct treatment of antithrombin 3 deficiency. Thank you.
Dr. Pinjala, there is one very interesting question from one of the participants, Dr. Ajay Gopal. He asked, how will you approach a patient with isolated femoral vein thrombosis? Will you consider thrombolysis, and will you also, if necessary, consider catheter-directed thrombolysis?
Well, I think you should remember there are two schools of thought here. We also know ATTRACT trial, those who approve it, those who disapprove it. Those who say that in ATTRACT trial, the results were not favorable. ACCP guidelines have also said, we do not use catheter-directed thrombolysis as the main line of management. But those interventionists, those who are fond of doing more interventions, they would like to say, I would consider CDT in these patients. Pharmacomechanical thrombolysis is also recommended in these patients. But if you see the ATTRACT trial, they say that they have not separated the proximal DVT, distal DVT in assessing the results of the ATTRACT trial. So that's why the results are not favorable, not in favor of thrombolysis. The 2-year development of PTS was not significantly reduced. You may have to follow these patients for longer than 2 years period of time to assess the benefits in PTS prevention. I think most of the times the thrombolysis may not reduce the PTS if you follow for just 2 years or 3 years. You may have to follow for a longer period of time is the argument given by these who would like to intervene, who would like to do thrombolysis. So in my practice, I give heparin as a first choice to the patient. But if the patient has got progressive thrombosis, which is going up into the iliac system, then I would consider thrombolysis, catheter-directed thrombolysis.
Yes, Dr. Khanna.
Dr. Pinjala, you told there is a drug which has come that is only for the antithrombin deficiency which is there.
Correct, correct.
And if you look at the antithrombin deficiency which is there, the epidemiology of that shows that it is less than 0.1%.
Of course.
Right.
Of course.
And there's a big list of the thrombophilia is there. There are about 20 factors which are there in the thrombophilia.
Beginning, we made it just a beginning.
Yeah. So I think probably we are at a very initial stage and probably tackling one. So I'm still not sure to give this idea to the population there that we have to treat a thrombophilia if it has not caused any problem there.
Correct.
No,
your point is your point is well taken. I'm just giving a hope to the people that the treatments are changing. The first genetically modified animal to be used for human use, antithrombin 3 is derived from the goat milk. That's what has interested me. I thought I wanted to share that something new that has happened, that goat is producing antithrombin 3 in goat's milk, and we are extracting that antithrombin 3 and using it for human survival, saving the human lives for the first time. So maybe in the next 10, 20 years, maybe in the next 10, 20 years, you may have an opportunity to supplement protein C, protein S also in similar fashion. We don't know. We just have to wait and see. But for the time being, you are right by saying that there is no direct treatment for thrombophilic disorders, except for anticoagulation, except for this antithrombin 3.
Dr. Bedi.
I think I may add or modify Dr. Pinjala's statement that in the next 10 years, we will not be looking at genetically modified animals. We'll be genetically modifying human beings. It's already there in research in places like Seoul and, where things don't come out much. Now, I have a few comments. One is you talked about catheter-directed thrombolysis. I think the people who are doing it, and I think everybody's doing it, especially Dr. Dicky Vadia and myself too, the indications are fairly straightforward for those people doing it. That is one, acute, extensive iliofemoral. So not just for femoral, it has to be acute, extensive iliofemoral. It has to be a young patient. Patient should have a survival, projected survival other than DVT of more than a year. And by acute, we mean 14 days. So these are some very, very specific, if it's more than 14 days, then it's a relative indication.
Then the lysis effect will be diminished as longer, it is longer thrombosis.
Now my question is, you told us very nicely about not doing a thrombophilia profile in acute stage. So what do you suggest? How many days after do we have to stop anticoagulants to do the thrombophilia profile?
First, you should treat it like DVT, like any other patient. 6 months anticoagulation or 1 year anticoagulation as per your protocol and patient profile. And then stop the medication for 2 weeks, 14 days minimum.
Okay.
And after 14 washout period, that is called washout period of the anticoagulant. By the time the resurgence of the proteins will come back, the natural mechanisms resume backwards. After 2 weeks, you can do the testing. But for gene testing, if somebody requires gene testing, you don't have to worry about the anticoagulation. For example, factor 5 Leiden or factor 2 gene abnormality, you don't need to worry about anticoagulation because that is not affected by anticoagulation. But we don't want to do gene testing as a primary thing. So algorithmic testing is very important. Mayo Clinic has produced algorithmic assessment of the thrombophilia patients. I think if you get time, you can just check that site. You'll know Mayo Clinic has produced algorithmic. Yes.
I was very intrigued by your slide on overuse of the testing.
Yeah, I wanted you to comment on that.
We have the other way around. I had a patient with provoked DVT. She was on tamoxifen and she had massive DVT. She had a massive actual massive pulmonary embolism, that is she arrested. Anyway, we treated her. Then I told her that you're on tamoxifen. That's why you don't need any more investigation. We stopped.
Correct.
She got the test done on her own. So we have the other way around now. People who are
positive, it has become positive.
No, it was negative.
The problem comes to me. I don't recommend them the tests routinely, but they get it done. They get it done asymptomatic people because somebody in their family had. They get the asymptomatic testing done and then they're positive. Now, what should we do? Should we give them anticoagulation? I tell them you don't require anticoagulation. That's why I stress the point. 90% of the patients with positive factors, congenital factors, do not develop thrombotic complications in their lifetime. Only 10% of them may develop the risk of thrombosis. So we have to convince the patients and family to a large extent not to go for anticoagulation unnecessarily. It may result in problem like the picture I have shown you, cutaneous thrombosis, where there's protein C deficiency along with factor 5 Leiden.
One more comment, last comment regarding the same thing is, what is the recurrence rate after NOACs? Supposing you has split score and everything, you say, okay, you need it for 2 years. So what I'm stressing is that if you put a patient on NOACs, it does not mean that he will not get a recurrence. He still
let me answer you. This is a very good question. You are in my I captured your attention. Einstein study, Amplify study, all of them have shown extended prophylaxis. So the data interpolated from that says that 80% chance of reduction of the recurrent thrombosis by extending the treatment after the initial anticoagulation with NOACs.
Yes.
So they are beneficial, but there is a slight increase in the risk of bleeding if you extend the
One.
treatment with NOACs. But definitely 80% is the reduction in the recurrent thrombosis in these patients by continuing the anticoagulation.
No, what I'm saying is that we should not make the patient so much relying on, he says, I'm taking NOACs, I can't get a recurrence. He can still get a recurrence. So he
You can
should
still
be
get a recurrence.
active. He should be
Dr.
relatively
10%.
active. That's what I want.
10% will develop still.
Dr. Khanna.
Regarding the timing that when you should test that, if you look at the paper of the New England Journal of Medicine 2017, it clearly says that if you want to do the testing and the patient of warfarin, stop it for 2 weeks and then you can do that. If the patient, the NOAC is there, you stop it for 2 days and then you can do it. If your patient on the heparin, low molecular heparin is there, you stop it for 24 hours and then you can do that. And if you have to carry out this test, then you can definitely do the factor 5 laden can be done at the time of the attack, or you can do the prothrombin 20210, which is there, that can be carried. So these are the 2 tests which can be carried out at the time of the attack, while the other tests which are there you have to stop the anticoagulants and then you have to carry out.
See, if the patient is in acute DVT, you don't stop the medication. If the patient is in acute DVT, you don't stop the medication.
Definitely, you're not going to stop for this testing only, but in case if you want to carry out, then this is the way you have to go.
Yeah.
So at the end, there is, because we'll be running out of time soon, there is one very controversial topic, and somebody has put this question here, and this is something which is asked by all our patients. Let us assume that there is a patient who came to us with proximal DVT, and now you have started anticoagulation. And according to the various protocols, you have maybe decided to give him 3 months, 6 months, or maybe 1 year of anticoagulation. What is the actual end point of stopping anticoagulation? Is it clearance of the thrombus, or is it the time period that you have decided? Common question, because when the Doppler is done and the clot still persists, even though that clot may now be fibrotic, the patient keeps on asking, why not continue anticoagulation? You understood?
Understood.
Yeah.
So the point here is, Ajay, you want to answer that?
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead.
I think, one is your Doppler finding, which is there, which will suggest that. The second very important thing is the D-dimer. You do the D-dimer in those patients, and if you find the D-dimer has come down or has become negligible, then probably you can think about that now you can stop the anticoagulation. And definitely you have to see for the other unprovoked factors which are there. So if somebody has got the cancer is there or other things which are there, you have to always take into consideration. And I think there is a formula about that carrying out, that when you can stop in the presence of the various factors which are there.
Do an organized thrombus,
okay,
if it's an organized thrombus, the D-dimer will be elevated? That is, no new thrombus is being formed.
No. There is no rise in D-dimer when it is dried out thrombus.
Yes. Then how can we rely on D-dimer values to stop the?
No, but you have to always combine that. There are certain things, the D-dimer, your Doppler finding, and the patient's precipitating factor which are there. Like the patient has the cancer is there, or the patient has a thrombophilia is there. Then in those cases, you have to combine all those factors and then decide about that. Are you going to stop the anticoagulation or not?
One is the patient profile. What are the chances of patient developing recurrent thrombosis? One should keep it in mind. Like if the patient has got high risk of rethrombosis, for example, if you apply Wells score or any other score, some kind of score that says the rethrombosis, you should continue the anticoagulation. If the patient is high risk of developing rethrombosis, but less chance of bleeding, there is a balance between these 2 events, then you will continue. But if there is high risk of bleeding, like ACCP guidelines says 3 months is sufficient for provoked DVT. You don't give provoked DVT more than 3 months unless they are associated with other risk factors. And similarly, there is high risk of bleeding, then also you don't give beyond 6 months. If there is a patient with high risk of Hasblet score is very high, then you don't give anticoagulation beyond 6 months. But there should be a striking balance between the recurrent thrombosis and recurrent bleeds risk in these patients. One has to keep that in mind, in addition to the factors of D-dimer and the volume, thrombus volume load on the deep venous system should be kept in mind for continuation of the anticoagulation in your patients in practical terms.
Finally, one comment from Dr. Dekiwadia.
Yeah. See, these, what I have understood after a number of cases of deep vein thrombosis, thrombolysis, etc., and is that it's not only the thrombus on which we should focus, because there is a very important and parallel component of inflammation and inflammatory changes. So, whilst doing a Doppler, one has to look into what is the vein wall looking still thick? Has there been irregularity there? If that is there, an ongoing inflammatory process is going on.
Yes. Perivenous halo is also important.
So this part goes pari passu in reference to deep vein thrombosis. Our today's talk was in relation to thrombophilias and how they are, what are the types and what should we do. So in the light of that, this inflammatory component does not deserve a long discussion. But how long to continue the anticoagulant treatments, whatever we are giving, then there are certain these components which should be done. We have been able to test only 5 cases where the thrombus which was aspirated, we have subjected it for long time culture, long time, not that 5 days culture.
Or bacteria.
Yes, bacterial culture, and after 1 month we have seen staphylococci growing it. So we are still working on it. It's too early to comment. This is just
that is a field of Ajay. He is raising his finger.
Yeah, that's correct. You know, we have done it in the varicose veins, even the C2 varicose vein. I'm not talking the C5 and 6. We could isolate the bacteria in about 40% of the patients, including the Pseudomonas, the Escherichia.
So we are digressing to the point
we are
of
digressing
microbiota.
from that, yeah. But I'm telling you that-
Microbiota is different from the eye to the mouth to the ear to the body parts of the person. Microbiota is a big subject on its own.
Right.
Friends, I think we've had a extremely great discussion today because the topic has been such that we can basically carry on and on and on. It leads to so many different avenues. So first of all, once again, I would like to thank and congratulate Dr. Pinjala for a lovely lecture, which gave rise to so much of thinking and discussion and took us in so many different directions. I'm sure we'll be able to continue this in the future. I'd also like to thank Dr. Sri Kumar for a nice case, again, which generated a lot of questions and discussions. I'd like to thank both our chairmen, Dr. Devendra Dekiwadia and Dr. Javier from Mexico. And Dr. Javier was so kind to join us at a very odd time in Mexico. Thank you, Javier, for joining. And Dr. Dekiwadia also, in spite of the floods in Rajkot, you may not know, but Rajkot is absolutely flooded, torrential rains, but somehow he's managed to come from his farm to the home to join. And finally, our panelists for today, our extremely senior and knowledgeable Dr. Ajay Khanna and Dr. Sulin Rajendran. This entire group of doctors today made this entire discussion and this topic so wonderful and so illuminating and informative. Thank you once again, and looking forward to seeing you again next week for one more session of the VEI program. And thank you at the end to Serdia for sponsoring this lovely, innovative and informative sessions for the Venous Association. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Shoaib, for conducting it very well.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. See you later.
See you.
Bye-bye.